Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about running Ansible playbooks inside of Rundeck. There's three key features of working with Ansible inside of Rundeck itself. Those come from running the playbooks themselves to sourcing a dynamic inventory from Ansible, as well as setting a default node executor within your projects. And we're going to dive into those each individually as we go through the presentation. One of the key benefits of running Ansible playbooks within Rundeck itself is that you can limit access with access control policies within Rundeck to give other users in your department or your company the ability to run Ansible playbooks without having to run those playbooks locally on their own machines. Maybe you don't want to give them access to an entire Ansible repository or to have the secrets to log into servers by themselves and have the ability to do other things on those servers. So you can take those playbooks, throw them behind Rundeck, and then through an easy web user interface, allow other users to run playbooks without having any knowledge of Ansible whatsoever. For the Ansible plugin to work within Rundeck, there's two things that you need. You need to have, or just one, you have to have Ansible installed on the server that's running Rundeck. All the playbooks do run locally on the Rundeck servers themselves. They're not dispatched out to another node to be run, though I will cover a way to run Ansible playbooks through the command line if you wanted to call other playbooks on another server. Once you get Ansible installed on your Rundeck server and you get your Ansible repository installed on your Rundeck server, one of the first things that you're going to configure is the default node executor in Rundeck. Typically, the default node executor for a project is SSH, but we do have the Ansible ad hoc node executor. This allows a user to run commands that will use Ansible to run those commands on a remote machine. Essentially, what you'll set is your executable. You can configure the Ansible configuration file where that's located on the Rundeck server. This is where my repository is located. So I'm pointing to the Ansible configuration file for that. Inside of that configuration file, I set a couple of things like a default inventory. We could potentially have Rundeck generate an inventory for you. If you had nodes that are already inside of Rundeck, if I were to check this box, it would generate an Ansible inventory from other nodes that are defined in Rundeck, but we're not going to explore that today. We can set where a vault key file path is. We can also have a vault password in the Rundeck key storage. And if I was using the Ansible vault, I could specify, which password I want to use in the key store for the decryption for that. And then we can set up what our typical authentication is going to be. Here I'm going to use a private key. My default user is going to be the Ubuntu user. All my servers are running AWS. So that's why I'm using the Ubuntu user here. And then the SSH key that I'm using to connect as that user. We can also specify privilege escalation with this as well, but we don't, if you want to override some of the configurations that you had within your Ansible playbooks. Likewise, for the file copier, we can also specify, and I'm not doing any file copying here, there's an Ansible file copier to use Ansible to copy files from the Rundeck server to your remote nodes as well. If we take a look at our node configurations, in this instance, I am pointing to an Ansible inventory file. And what this essentially does, having this resource configuration here, is that I am populating my nodes in Rundeck from my Ansible inventory. In this case, I am using a dynamic Ansible inventory. And what that means is that my Ansible inventory file itself is using the AWS Ansible inventory plugin. So I'm dynamically sourcing nodes from AWS to Ansible, and in turn, I'm populating Rundeck with those nodes that Ansible sees in AWS. Again, I have to specify where my configuration path is here. In this case, I'm telling it to gather facts, and then I'm also limiting, what targets that I want to see here. I'm actually going to remove this limit. We can specify what we want to use for the SSH connection to gather the facts, since we're going to use Ansible to log into each one of those servers to gather facts. The only downside to this is that the private key used for this is not stored in the Rundeck key storage. And again, we're going to see these privilege escalations options that are very familiar throughout Ansible and using Ansible with Rundeck. One other enhancement that I made is with Rundeck Enterprise, we do have what's called node enhancers. Let me jump back over here. With Rundeck Enterprise, we do have what's called node enhancers. What a node enhancer allows me to do is to add additional attributes to my Rundeck nodes that are especially handy when sourcing nodes from a dynamic inventory source. Here I'm using the regex that says basically for all nodes, I want to set the username that I want to connect as to Ubuntu. And then here I could also add additional tags as well to any of those nodes. So we have our nodes, we have our node enhancers. When I take a look at my nodes in Rundeck, where that node enhancer comes in handy here is over here where you see the user Ubuntu. The node enhancer is actually making that user set to Ubuntu. If I had different tags on my instances that were being sourced, maybe I had a tag that had an environment for development, an environment for production, I could very easily set additional SSH keys or different usernames that I'd want to connect as on those servers based on some of those node attributes that are sourced dynamically from an environment like AWS. The real meat of running Ansible playbooks and Rundeck comes from running jobs that are going to facade a playbook. And we have a lot of different options. When we go through and we create a new job in Rundeck, we have different options for the kinds of playbooks that we want to run. And today, more specifically, we're going to run through what the differences are in these different job steps, how they work, and how they can help you in your environments. We're going to see what's called an Ansible inline workflow node step plugin. And we also have an Ansible workflow node step plugin. The biggest difference between these two is that the inline is going to allow you to specify your playbook inline rather than referencing one that may already be on your server. And then the workflow node step, this is where you're going to specify a playbook that's going to run on your server. Now there is a little bit of a distinction here. We have these are called node step plugins. They work a little bit differently. These are going to target the nodes that you're going to dispatch to your nodes and run those playbooks independently on each node. But under the workflow steps plugin, we have an Ansible module job step, an Ansible playbook inline job step, an Ansible playbook job step. And the difference between the ones that are specified under the workflow steps as opposed to the node steps is that when these playbooks, when you specify a playbook here, it's going to run and output what's being run very similar to what you're used to if you were to run it from the command line from your control machine. We're going to start with a very basic Ansible module job. With this workflow module, what you'll see here is, if we were to run an Ansible command and specify a module from the command line, setup's a pretty common one to use. What we'll see here is that we're basically saying, hey, we're going to run the setup command based on an inventory that I'm going to provide to it. I'm not specifying any of the SSH connection information here. By not doing this, this is going to inherit the defaults that I've set up at the project level. And for this case, I'm not turning on any privilege escalation. The nodes that I'm going to target are the ones that have essentially the Ansible group, tag demo web, tag demo Postgres, and you'll see that those nodes are matched here. And when I run this job, what you'll see is a log output that's going to look very similar to how we would run the Ansible command locally from our on control machines. Now, if I didn't want to use the Ansible module, or maybe I wanted to dispatch the commands differently, and bear with me while my page is loading, I could do what's called an inline workflow step here. And we'll take a look at this job definition before we run it. And I'm going to throw this up here for a second. The one that I'm running here is the inline workflow node step that you see here. And we're going to run both of these. One, we're going to run it as an inline workflow node step, and then we're also going to run it as a inline playbook here. The biggest difference is this is going to dispatch the playbook run to the nodes in a similar fashion to if you were running a command that wasn't Ansible across a variety of different nodes. Here, I'm going to say run it against all hosts. Ansible by default does use the -- limit behind the scenes. That -- limit comes into play with the node filter that I'm specifying here. And then what you'll see here is an inline playbook, and I just have one task. It's a setup task, and then I'm doing a debug and outputting the var after it runs for each node. When we run this job, what we will notice is that the Rundeck output is going to dispatch this. Oh, this is the workflow step here. So again, we have our log output, just like what we would expect to see from a control machine. Now let's jump over to the other job that we're going to run here. This is the inline workflow step. This one should dispatch to all nodes. Nope, running the wrong one again. Bear with me here. Okay, here's the one I want to run, the inline job step. So when I go to run this job, what you're going to notice is that this job is going to run, dispatch the playbook, the task against each node independently, rather than running it all at once. So you could easily dispatch nodes or playbooks across different nodes and kind of get an idea where each one of those is being processed. If we were to go to log view, this is going to be, initially it looks the same, but what we will notice with the log view here is that it's a different playbook run for each node that we specified. Now, if you wanted to run an Ansible playbook from the command line, or the way that we would run it from a command line is we were running from our control machine. This is not using the Ansible, any of the Ansible plugins whatsoever. This is using a script step where I'm going into the directory where my playbook is, and I'm passing the information for authentication that I need to run this playbook. Now, one of the things that you will notice is that with the using the Ansible modules within Rundeck, I can store my private keys in my key storage. But if I were to run Ansible from a command line, like I'm doing here, I would need my private keys stored on the Rundeck server so that the command line could access that. And I'm going to put a user on this as well. Now, again, this is another example of, if I were to run this, this is going to run it exactly like I would expect it from my control machine. And we're just going to let this job run behind the scenes. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind with this. There's a couple of different ways that you can set up your playbooks within Ansible themselves. One of the things that we can do is, you can still have your groups as you can have your Ansible playbooks have the limit for the groups for what that playbook is going to run in, and you can still specify that playbook within Rundeck itself. Or you can also have your playbooks not have a limit and allow Rundeck itself to enforce those limits. And we're going to take a quick look at what the difference is between those, how those two different playbooks run. So the first one we're going to look at the one that where in the playbook itself, I'm specifying what group I want that playbook to run against. If I take a look at this job before I run it, what we're going to notice is we have a target of 14 different nodes here, but the playbook itself says I only want to allow those steps to run on a specific number of nodes or specific servers in my Ansible inventory. So when I go to run this job, the fact that my Ansible playbook has the limit that's in it, Rundeck is still going to essentially try to run those playbooks against all the nodes. But what you're going to find out is that as I go in and I look at the output here, there's no host matched. And these hosts have been skipped because they don't match the group that I specified in the playbook. But if I come down here to these instances, what we're going to find is, this is one where this server is part of that group, and essentially my Ansible inventory, Rundeck's still going to run the playbook against it. So even though in Rundeck, my node filter is set to everything, the Ansible playbook limit still comes into play and only limits that playbook to run against the servers that I want to run against. If I take a look, this is essentially the same playbook that runs. The only difference is the file that I'm specifying here is, this is the playbook that I'm running here where it says host equals all. If we take a look at the configuration for this job, here I'm limiting, which servers I want to run this against. So even though my playbook at this point is wide open, I can enforce the limit with Rundeck itself. When I go to run this playbook, what we'll notice is, and just show you that, let me jump back over here to show you, which inventory it is running. So it's not all smoke and mirrors. You'll notice here that I am running that web Rundeck YAML playbook that we saw over here in the editor. When we run this playbook, what we're going to see is that that limit does take effect, and it's only going to run against those 3 nodes that I've designated part of that node filter. And you can see that down here at the end of this playbook run. Now, we're not just limited to specifying playbooks. One of the things that we can do with our Rundeck jobs is that we can pass options from Rundeck. Here I have a job that's going to create a database where I can allow a user to create a database on a server. They can specify the username and the password. And then when I go to my job definition, I can map using a YAML syntax. I can map those options from Rundeck to variables that I'm going to use inside of my playbook. And then here I'm also dispatching only to my Postgres node that's in my inventory as well. So when I go to run this create database job step, this is going to run a playbook that's going to create a database on a remote Postgres instance. And if we take a look at the output here, we'll see that we're creating, we're adding a user, and then now we're creating that database as well as part of that playbook run. And I mean, that's part of the real power behind running your playbooks. Behind Rundeck itself is you have the ability to create options that allow users to interact with your Ansible playbooks, but still have control over the kind of information that they want to input. Having the options in Rundeck is really powerful because you take out the guesswork behind, what options a user might have to pass from a command line to just throwing it behind Rundeck itself. And with the scheduling capabilities of Rundeck, you could also have playbooks that maybe do server patching on a regular basis and schedule those as well. One of the things that I will point out with this, with our nodes, I do have an inventory that's being dynamically sourced. And with that, I do have it gathering facts. And the facts that Ansible returns on each one of those servers now also become node attributes within Rundeck. And some of the power behind that is that any one of these types of node attributes that Ansible provides, like distribution, for example, we could actually use that in a node filter and pull all the servers that match that. And that node filter could be used in the node view, but it could also be used in a job as well.
Dutch, we have a question for you here. For high load inventories, which method would you suggest as a node or workflow steps?
That's a good question. The key difference between the two is that the workflow step is going to rely on Ansible entirely for dispatching. So, how many servers you're communicating with in parallel, you're going to manage that through Ansible and Python based on what's in your Ansible configuration file. If you were to use the job step for running the playbook, then for each one of those playbooks that runs, we're going to basically be invoking a thread, and Rundeck's going to be kicking off multiple playbook runs potentially in parallel. I know it doesn't entirely answer the question, but to give you an idea of what that looks like, a minute ago we ran the setup playbook against a server. By default, Rundeck's going to target one server at a time, but in our node configuration, we can turn on a thread count. And so if I made this Rundeck thread count 3, then that playbook gets dispatched to 3 nodes at the same time. And we want to see that in action here. I'm going to kick off this job. And what we will see is that each one of these playbooks are going to run in tandem rather than sequentially. And as you saw, as I started the job, they all kicked off at the same time. So it really comes down to, if you want Rundeck to manage the threading of those jobs and having them dispatched to multiple servers in parallel, or if you want Python and Ansible to manage that. So just to recap here, I mean, the key things behind Rundeck itself, Rundeck and Ansible, is that we have a dynamic inventory or an inventory source that we can specify within Rundeck. This is going to allow you to load nodes in Rundeck from your Ansible inventory. Everything that we see in the nodes view itself is sourced from my Ansible inventory. I'm also gathering facts on those. When we have a dynamic inventory with something coming from like Ansible, we can use node enhancers. Node enhancers will allow us to add multiple attributes to servers based on attributes that come from that inventory. We have a node executor in Rundeck that's going to be how Rundeck dispatches commands to the servers. And then ultimately the real power of it comes from the job steps themselves, whether you're running a module or an inline playbook.